Welcome to International Geneva. The 40th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council will conclude this Friday. What concrete outcomes have been achieved when it comes to human rights and business? The UN Global Compact Network Switzerland is the platform for the UN Global Compact initiative here in Switzerland. It aims to improve the corporate social responsibility and sustainability of Swiss companies doing business abroad. Here to discuss is its Executive Director, Antonio Hautle. Thank you so much for joining us, Antonio. So what kind of concrete outcomes have you seen when it comes to business and human rights?
Yeah, it probably is not to expect that we have direct outcomes from an international meeting like this. The two focuses where I see important for business, also locally and internationally, is the child labour issue on the one side, and the other side, the question of handicapped people. Child labour is crucial in all the supply chains, in all the production sites, globally and locally. And the handicapped issue is probably of a big issue also even here in Switzerland. How do we integrate handicapped people? How do we facilitate access to work, access to different possibilities for handicapped people?
But when you have such a huge event like the Human Rights Council sessions taking place in Geneva, should the human rights issue linked to business not be at the top of the agenda?
From our perspective, yes, sure. But I'm realistic. In politics, it's oftentimes on bilateral issues, on global issues, more on the political side. But I think the UN Global Compact is one of the actors who can play and must play the role with World Business Council and others to really bring in the business sector into these global human rights issues too.
But you have not been in Geneva. Why have you not been invited?
Yeah, I could have attended, but let's be clear, my role here in Switzerland is promote human rights and business sustainability within the Swiss business and not to be on all international discussions. We follow the results, we will follow the outcomes at the end and see has it a concrete implication for us here.
So do you expect that some of these results will have a direct impact on Swiss businesses and corporations doing business in other countries?
Not immediately. In a mid and long term, yes. Because if you see what is happening worldwide, it's somehow difficult because the human rights situation is degrading. We have these conflicts with the different countries. They are topic also during these meetings, what is happening in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Iraq, in Russia, Turkey, etc., are really issues which are important and do influence directly the situation of transnational and local companies. And they have to handle these conflicts on the one side because they can come under pressure. On the other side, they have to watch out to really respect the human rights in all circumstances.
It's just overwhelming because there are so many issues on the table when it comes to human rights, but still the focus is on political human rights. The situation in Syria, the lack of freedom of expression in Saudi Arabia and the recent crackdown there, the situation of the Rohingya in Myanmar. How can you bring in the business component into the human rights discussion?
We follow a very pragmatic approach. I think that's the only possibility from the business side. The big challenge we have is in the supply chain and in the distribution chain. And there, big transnational companies, and we have a lot of them here in Switzerland, in Europe and the US, we have a big influence over these supply chains. So what we try is to really support companies, but also sensibilize big companies to have a close watch what is happening in their supply chain concerning human rights and how they can handle that locally in the sensitive parts of the world, but also along, let's be clear, we have also human rights violations here in Europe. How can you handle that and control it and reduce as much as possible the negative impact and promote and create as much positive impact as possible.
But Antonio, are these big Swiss multinationals responsive, and do they change their way of working and their operations when it comes to human rights? Have you noticed any recent change?
I'm in the discussion as business ethician since the early 80s during my studies, and these topics were not really on the agenda of the core businesses. What I have observed in the last 30 years is really a change due to discussions, pressure from civil society, etc. And I observe in Switzerland that the big transnationals, most of the big transnationals, for them it's clear, the agenda of human rights due diligence must be a big concern, and we observe more and more companies who are really starting or already have integrated it in their strategies and in their management processes.
Talking about these big companies, could you give us any specific example that is standing out?
I mean, you have the big ones in Basel. For instance, Roche Novartis, they had to adapt that. And I recently followed one of their webinars, Novartis, showing how they developed the whole system over the last 15 years. And to make it clear, they're at a complete other place they were 15, 20 years ago. The same would count for Nestlé, who has a direct client relation. We have certain areas, especially the middle-sized and the smaller companies who are in supply chain systems, who are not yet that aware because they don't see the direct contact. They may not have the direct pressure from public, from civil society, because they're not seen as the big transnationals.
So the big challenge is really in getting those small and medium-sized enterprises to respect human rights more as well when they do business abroad.
I mean, the big challenge for all companies is, we call that do know your supply chain. And if you have, like big companies, 80,000 to 150,000 first-level suppliers and more, you can imagine what that means to control that.
It's so complex. Is it not impossible to control this long supply chain, which is getting longer and longer and more difficult to understand as well because of blockchain and technology and all that?
You mentioned it. Blockchain may be one approach to start to handle it on a different level. Let's be clear. We are not able right now to control tier 1 to 100 or 1,000 in complicated, like a computer, who may have hundreds of sub-suppliers. The big companies tell us that they are able to control up to a certain level, first tier. Second tier maybe, third tier becomes already difficult, up to impossible. So we have now new approaches. The newest example is Nestlé, using analysis of satellites to control the production fields of palm oil to see how they move. So I think there will be new technologies which will help. But let's be also clear, it's not about only the company's issues, it's really also a political issue. How do you want, as a company, providing or buying semi-products or raw materials in a certain country where you don't have any rule of law, where government is not respecting the basic human rights or even violating it? In conflict areas, commodity is one of the difficult and sensitive issues, which is very crucial for Switzerland. So I think we have done a lot of progress in the last 20 years, but there is still a lot to be done and to go step by step.
And progress needs to come from both ends, from the start and from the finish line as well. Now, at UN Global Compact Network Switzerland, you have 10 principles. And number 1 is basically businesses have to protect human rights. Yes. There's also the abolition of child labor, which you've mentioned, and the protection of the environment. But how can you better enforce this principle? As we mentioned, is it the political will, and can you establish any new regulations here in Switzerland?
Well, to make it clear, the UN Global Compact and the Global Compact Network Switzerland are organizations who voluntarily gather the companies who want to engage in the 10 principles and the Sustainable Development Goals. We do not have any power to impose these rules. What we can do is to evict or eject companies who do not respect them. We had the case with Volkswagen. After diesel scandal, they were delisted. And we will have, or we have on a regular basis, confidential dialogues with member companies where we have issues. But the objective is to motivate and support the companies to improve their rules. I think it's really the discussion which is going on locally and globally. How do we align businesses on human rights due diligence? With the Ruggie principles, a lot of things are happening, but it's still in an evolution, and let's be realistic. The UN is not a global government. It's even weakening. The WTO is not very strong at the moment. These are the realities, and we as Global Compact have to handle that. And we try to really push the voluntary principles and say, let's put standards on a voluntary basis. And we are seeing other governments like the UK, like US, and also OECD countries scaling up different legislative systems too. I think there will be more in the future.
Let's talk about your members as well, Antonio. Now you have, for example, commodity traders Trafigura and Glencore as well as your members. Also other industries, for example, Swiss Life and Zurich Insurance as well. Does this not make you biased?
No, the principle of the UN Compact is we want the engagement of the company and to be serious. And they have to report year after year on their progress, communication on progress. We do not expect that they are perfect. No company can be perfect. The world is grey, it's not black and white.
But you also get fees from these members, so they basically pay you. How do you reconcile this?
Yeah, I mean, our role is a facilitating role. Our role is not the judge. That's to the states, to NGOs, to other networks. What we want to be a facilitator to bring companies together, to confront them or to confront each other. That's the main thing in our sharing and learnings. That's the main approach, that the company is telling how they reached certain level of good practice, best practices that others can learn. And also a cross-sectoral transfer of this knowledge is very important because we have sectors who are much more advanced, like the pharmaceutical, for instance, and we know that we have still big issues in the sector of commodities. So that's the main idea, and we really try to push companies to be in critical dialogue and to move them forward with these processes.
To step up the action, you also need money, of course, and funding. Now, your budget is around 400,000 Swiss francs a year. Not a lot for this kind of scale. How are you planning to raise funding, and what is your budget pipeline looking like?
Let's see. You have to see the UN Global Compact as a global organization, and then the local networks, some 75 local networks in 120, more or less 120 countries. We in Switzerland, we are a business association, mainly funded 70% are membership fees from our members. And then we have a public-private partnership with the Swiss Federal Confederation, but that's more oriented project-wise, so it's a project contribution on a limited time. It's clear we need more companies who engage, who take that serious, who speak up and show we are serious about it, and we expose ourselves also to critical, constructive, critical feedbacks. And to be honest, I'm looking to having more members engaging publicly and clearly invest in this. We have now 158 members. I would like to have some 1,500 in Switzerland. So we invite all companies to be serious, to engage locally and globally in this agenda of the UN Global Compact, connecting these 10 business principles for sustainable business to the SDG agenda locally and globally.
Let's bring in the Responsible Business Initiative as well, which is a key debate here in Switzerland, and probably we are going to vote on it next year if everything goes well. Now, what kind of impact would this have on the Swiss corporations on the ground overseas?
Well, we do not really see the consequences yet, and it's not up to our network to be a political actor in the field. We clearly say our position is not for or against the initiative because our role is to facilitate the progress of our companies in the field. But what is important, this initiative brings the discussion on business responsibility right at the core of society. And I think that is needed. It's absolutely needed that we as business on the one side are aware that we are responsible. But, and now comes the other side, we as consumers have also to be critical because we are in a market economy, and as long as we are in the market economy, the market is requesting products and services. We observe sometimes new approaches who the consumers or the middle consumers, so in the supply chain, do not request. And you have to pay a price. At the beginning, sustainability, economic, ecological and social sustainability is an investment. And it's not cheap. So
absolutely
there is a big challenge. How can we sell the content of a product and a service which is also socially and ecologically sustainable and sell that as a value added to us as consumers or to companies who will use that in their products and service again. There still we have to scale up and to make clear, I want a product which is
a lot of challenges coming up. Antonio, before we go, just briefly, you also have at the UN Global Compact Network Switzerland a Tour de Suisse on responsible business. Just in a couple of words, what is it all about and what are you hoping to achieve?
So the idea of the Tour de Suisse is to go around Switzerland and to promote the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact, the approach of sustainable and responsible business, and what opportunities the Sustainable Development Goals are offering to private sector in Switzerland.